Today, we're going to explore some of the lesser-known aspects of Jesus' life and teachings that don't always make it into traditional biblical accounts. From apocryphal gospels to historical texts, there's so much more to the story of Jesus than what we typically hear. One of the biggest challenges in understanding Jesus' significance is trying to contextualize him within a broader historical framework. It's easy to get caught up in the biblical narrative and forget that Jesus was a real person living in a specific time and place. But when we start to look at him through the lens of ancient history, things get a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting. The problem is so much of what we think we know about Jesus comes from a small handful of sources, and there are a lot of gaps in the story. Jesus' life and teachings are often reduced to a few key events and sayings, but there's so much more to it than that. In fact, if we're being honest, a lot of what we think we know about Jesus is based on incomplete or even inaccurate information. The Bible is an amazing resource, but it's not the only one, and it's definitely not without its biases and limitations. When we start to look at other sources, like the apocryphal gospels or the writings of ancient historians, we start to get a much more nuanced picture of who Jesus was and what he was all about. It's not always comfortable, and it's not always easy to reconcile with what we've been taught, but it's definitely worth exploring. The more we learn about Jesus, the more we realize how much is lost or ignored in mainstream narratives. There are entire books, entire traditions, entire ways of understanding Jesus that have been forgotten or suppressed over the centuries. And yet, these alternate perspectives can be incredibly powerful. They can help us see Jesus in a new light, and they can challenge us to think more deeply about what it means to follow him. One of the most fascinating sources of information about Jesus is the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas. This ancient text is full of sayings and teachings that are completely unknown to most Christians, and yet they're attributed to Jesus himself. It's a window into a completely different side of Jesus, one that's more mystical, more introspective, and more radical than we often give him credit for. And yet, for centuries, this gospel was suppressed, hidden away from the faithful because it didn't fit with the official narrative. Another great example is the writing of the ancient historian Josephus. This Jewish scholar lived in the 1st century and wrote extensively about the events of his time, including the life and death of Jesus. What's amazing is that Josephus' account of Jesus is totally different from what we find in the Bible. It's more straightforward, more historical, and more focused on the political context in which Jesus lived. It's a totally different Jesus, one that's more rooted in the real world and less concerned with miracles and divine interventions. But one of the most controversial perspectives on Jesus comes from the ancient Gnostic texts. These esoteric writings are all about secret knowledge, mystical experiences, and the true nature of the universe. And at the heart of it all is Jesus, depicted as a cosmic revealer, a bringer of light and truth. It's a Jesus that's far removed from the gentle Savior we're familiar with. And yet it's a perspective that's been around since the earliest days of Christianity. One of the most fascinating insights we can gain from these alternative sources is just how complex and multifaceted Jesus was. He wasn't just a simple preacher or a miracle worker. He was a thinker, a teacher, and a revolutionary. He challenged the status quo, he upset the establishment, and he dared to dream of a world that was radically different from the one he lived in. And when we start to see him in this light, we begin to realize just how much we've lost by reducing him to a few simplistic tropes or dogmatic formulas. In summary, today we've explored the importance of looking beyond traditional biblical accounts to get a more complete picture of Jesus' life and teachings. We've delved into some of the alternative sources that give us a more nuanced view of who Jesus was and what he was all about. And we've challenged ourselves to think more deeply about what it means to follow Jesus in the modern world. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the untold secrets of Jesus. If you want to explore more historical perspectives on religious figures, be sure to check out our video on the hidden history of the Buddha. And let us know in the comments, what do you think is the most important aspect of Jesus' life and teachings that's often overlooked? We'd love to hear from you.